I want to be clear before the panel asks that I did not do anything unusual. I processed intake documentation. I offered a ration bar. I said easy twice. Everything that followed was to the best of my understanding, the Skorath's own decision, and I would appreciate it if the record reflected that I was as surprised as anyone. More surprised than most, actually, because most people in that hold had the good sense to be frightened, and at least fright is a legible response. I was confused. There is a meaningful difference, and I think the distinction matters for what this panel is trying to determine. My name is Dela Maris. I am a third-cycle board service trainee, currently assigned to intake processing aboard the transport barge Outer Ven on the Corindal to Tesek resettlement corridor. I have been in that posting for 17 days as of the date of the incident. Prior to the incident, my most significant professional challenge had been a sealing malfunction on the Deck 4 document scanner that kept rejecting the biometric chips in Vethakari identity cards. The Vethakari chips are manufactured with a slightly thinner tolerance on the data edge than the compact standard reader expects, a difference of approximately 0.3 millimeters, which should not matter but apparently does. I had submitted a requisition for a calibration kit on day 9. As of the incident, it had not arrived. I was working around the malfunction with a hand lens and a stylus, which is slow and imprecise, and has a non-trivial error rate if you're tired. And I mention all of this only because it explains why I was still at my processing station at the hour Commander Haller arrived, when I should, by any reasonable rotation schedule, have already gone to evening meal. The Outer Ven is a Class 2 civilian transport barge. Lower holding Deck 4, my assignment carries 340 civilian refugees in a stacked bunk configuration across 6 lateral rows. The barge has been making the Corindal to Tesek run for 11 years under the same duty officer, the same chief engineer, and the same meal distribution supervisor, and the efficiency of its operations reflects this. The bunks are old, and the ventilation is not evenly distributed, and the overhead panels run at a color temperature that makes everyone look unwell, whether they are or not, but the forms are filed on time, the feeding rotations are consistent, and the duty officer's log is the most precise documentation I have encountered in 17 days of a posting that has required me to read a great deal of documentation. These things matter on a long transit. These are the things that keep 340 frightened people from becoming something worse. The refugees are Vethakari, Soranel, and a small number of Keth origin families who came to the Corindal corridor from a secondary displacement, ended up on the Outer Ven's manifest almost by administrative accident. They weren't the population the barge was configured for. Their registration documents use a different family name ordering system, and the compact's intake database defaults to the Soranel system, which means if you're not watching for it, you create errors in the record that are tedious to unwind later. I had been watching for it since day 2. I had also been learning, when time permitted, which was less often than I would have liked, the names of the children. Not because the module told me to, the module said to maintain professional impartiality, but because in my experience, a processing environment where adults know that you know their child's name is an environment where the adults are slightly calmer, and calm adults make for cleaner documentation, and clean documentation makes my job easier. I am not sure this is what the module means by professional impartiality. I think it might be. I think the module might be using the word in a way that encompasses more than its strict definition. I had processed in 17 days 212 intake forms, fielded 47 documentation inquiries, submitted 3 maintenance requisitions, the calibration kit, a replacement seal for the bunk row ventilation manifold in row 4, and a request for an additional data terminal because sharing one terminal between intake processing and duty officer administrative functions produces scheduling conflicts that neither party enjoys, and eaten approximately 2/3 of my scheduled meals at my station rather than the mess deck because my rotation timing rarely aligned with the meal rotation schedule in a way that gave me more than 12 minutes to eat in the mess before I needed to be back at my station. The ration bar on my table on the evening of the incident was dinner. I had been meaning to eat it. I had not gotten to it yet. None of this is relevant to the incident. I include it for context. I want the panel to understand what Deck 4 was and what I was doing in it, so that when I describe what happened, the description sits inside something accurate. I was not watching the deck entrance when Commander Haller came through it. I heard it, though. The magnetic seal on Deck 4's main hatch makes a distinctive 2-tone release when it cycles. a lower tone as the seal disengages and a slightly higher tone as the secondary pressure equalization clears. I had been hearing it multiple times a day for 17 days, and I had learned to register it the way you learn to register any recurring sound in a small enclosed space. Not with attention, just with background awareness. Two-tone release. Someone coming in or going out. I noted it and kept working. What made me look up was not the hatch. It was the quality of what followed. 340 people in an enclosed space at evening hour produce a consistent ambient noise. It is not pleasant noise. It is the noise of people who are tired and close together and uncertain about where they are going and what will happen when they get there. But it is consistent, and the consistency becomes its own kind of presence when it's stopped, not by degrees but all at once. The way a signal cuts when a power source fails. I looked up. Commander Trev's hauler was standing inside the Deck 4 entrance with 6 people I didn't recognize and 2 handler rigs I did recognize. Handler rigs for large containment animals have a specific silhouette that I had studied in. The orientation module because I study everything. The control harness with its broadcast array. The dual-line leads with their graded tension calibration. The dampening collars with their indicator lights cycling through standby mode. The rigs told me what was on the other side of the still cycling hatch before the hatch finished its cycle. Skorath. I knew what they were from the module. The module had given them 2 sections and a supplementary warning notation, which in orientation materials is a reliable indicator of significance. 6-limbed pack hunters native to the Tessic outer shelf, used by the Compact Containment Division for compliance operations in enclosed spaces because their threat display. A chest-deep resonance snarl, produced at a frequency below the threshold of conscious hearing, felt as a vibration in the sternum of anything standing within 15 to 20 meters, is almost universally effective at producing compliance behavior in non-Skorath species, including all known sapient species and non-sapient ones. The module had been precise about this. The module had also noted that Skorath were not aggressive toward compliant subjects, and that handler teams maintained full behavioral control through dampening collar signal at all times. I had read that and filed it under theoretically reassuring. There is a category of reassurance that is accurate but insufficient, and that is where I had filed it. 8 of them came through the hatch. 6 adults and 2 juveniles, on handler leads, in the 2x2 entry formation the module had described and diagrammed. The adults were the color of deep water in low light. A blue so dark it reads as black that shifted at the edges towards slate when the overhead panel light caught their integument at an angle. Their 6 limbs moved in an offset sequence that was deeply, specifically wrong in the way that things with too many joints at the wrong positions are wrong, and each foreleg ended in a retracted dew-blade sheath that I could identify at distance, because the sheaths were a slightly lighter material than the surrounding integument, with a faint iridescent quality that I found later myself looking at more often than I expected to. The eyes were amber and set wide on a skull that was broad and flat and designed clearly to carry a very large jaw. The juveniles were 2/3 the adult size and had the particular quality of young predators everywhere, which is that they look exactly like the adults, except for a looseness in their movements. That suggests they haven't fully integrated the decision-making systems that govern the adult's precise economy of motion. The resonance snarl started before the last handler was through the hatch. It wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was a sound that lived below the threshold at which ears process sound, and what it produced in Deck 4 was not a noise but a sensation, a pressure in the lower chest that my body interpreted, before my brain had time to weigh in, as danger of a fundamental kind, not any specific danger, the category of danger that predates categories. 340 people took a collective step backward, a movement so synchronized it looked choreographed. Children were grabbed. Someone in the rear bunk row made a sound that wasn't quite language. I felt the resonance in my sternum and noted it, the way you note something your body is doing that you didn't instruct it to do, and went back to my forms. I want to be clear that this was not bravery. I have thought about this carefully. Bravery involves perceiving a threat and choosing to engage despite it. What I was doing was perceiving a situation and determining that my available options were stop working and stand in a space where seeing useful was happening, or continue working and process the 11 forms in front of me. The second option seemed more useful. The module had said the animals were handler-controlled. I believed the module, or at least I had no information that contradicted it. I was doing my job. The most useful thing I could do in the situation was continue to do my job, because the 11 people whose forms I was processing were watching from the bunk rows. And if I abandoned their documentation now, they would have to come back tomorrow, and the scanner malfunction would still be there, and we would all be in the same position but further behind. Commander Haller announced, in the practiced carrying voice of someone accustomed to making announcements in spaces where people would prefer not to hear them, that he had a compact resettlement authority extraction order for 11 individuals. He read the names from a datapad. He said the individuals should present themselves at the forward processing station immediately. He said the compact took the safety and welfare of all barge residents very seriously. He said the Skorath handler teams were present as a precautionary measure and were fully under handler control at all times. Nobody moved toward him. This was understandable. 340 people who had spent significant portions of their lives being processed by authorities of various kinds in various languages under various legal frameworks had just been told that authority wanted 11 of them right now, in the presence of 8 animals currently producing a subsonic effect in all of their chests. The resonance was still going. It had not stopped when Haller started speaking. It operated at a frequency that the body interprets as warning regardless of what the ears are hearing. Nobody was going to walk toward that. It wasn't defiance and it wasn't stubbornness. It was the oldest available instruction overriding everything more recent. Commander Haller read the names again. The second reading had a quality the first hadn't. A tightening in the production of the consonants. A small adjustment in emphasis that communicated that the patience available for this process was finite and declining. I noted this and kept working. The handler teams moved the Skorath into the lateral compliance positions. I had read about these in the module. A sweep formation that narrows the effective movement space of the target area and creates a corral effect by positioning animals at the lateral walls and advancing the formation gradually toward the center. I found, watching it in practice, that it was very well designed. The Skorath moved through the formations of positioning with a smooth, fluid efficiency that suggested extensive repetition, the kind of motion that has ceased to require individual decisions about each step. The resonance snarl remained constant. The deck had the quality of a space becoming smaller without any physical dimension changing. Here is the moment the deposition is, I understand, most interested in. The juvenile on the left handler's second lead, the smaller of the two. Juveniles, subsequently identified in the assessment as OR, broke handler signal at 4 minutes and 12 seconds after entry. The handler's control panel logged the signal interruption. That log was entered into evidence and the panel has it. What the log notes as a signal interruption was, from my position, a juvenile Skorath turning away from its handler with a deliberateness that looked less like malfunction than like decision, a considered reorientation, like a person's who has been listening to a conversation and has identified something more interesting on the other side of the room, or move through the Deck 4 refugee population with care, not around them, not through them, but threading between them in a way that never brought him into contact with anyone, a path that required a readjustment at the meal station and a course correction around a bunk support strut. In a direct line that ended at my processing table, he sat down next to it. His left foreleg, the one I could see most clearly, the one with the dew blade sheath at full retraction, came to rest approximately 30 centimeters from my left boot. I looked at him. He looked at me. His eyes were the specific amber of a warning light, but the quality of the look was not, as far as I could determine, warning. It was evaluation, the careful, patient evaluation of an animal that is spending real attention on something it has found significant. I have seen that look from supervisors reviewing my documentation with the intention of finding something to correct. The look said, "I am determining what this is." "Easy," I said, because I didn't know what else to say and it seemed like useful information to offer. I said it the way you say it to something that's wound tight. Quietly, flatly, as a fact about the available options rather than a command. Then I went back to my form. The second juvenile, Sol, in the assessment, broke signal at 4 minutes and 40 seconds. He came to the same position by a different route, moving around the meal distribution station from the east side rather than the west, and sat down on my right. I was bracketed. This might have been alarming, but both of them had lowered their heads to a resting angle, and the resonance coming from their chests had shifted frequency. Not the compliance snarl I had felt in my sternum when they entered, but something lower and steadier that I didn't recognize from the module. I would be told later this is called settling vocalization, used within a pack to communicate that a position has been taken and evaluated and found acceptable. At the time, I thought something had changed in their behavioral state and filed it provisionally under possibly less concerning than before. I gave Orr a piece of my ration bar. I should not have done this. It is not protocol-compliant behavior in a containment situation. I have noted this in my own report, and I note it again here for completeness. I had the ration bar on the table because I had not had time to eat. Orr's nose, a broad, flat instrument running the full width of his skull, with a dense array of sensory pits along the leading edge that were clearly working through some analysis, was within 15 centimeters of it and, closing, I was not sure whether to redirect the interest or honor it. The module had not covered this specific scenario. I made a judgment and broke off a corner of the bar and offered it. He took it very carefully, in the precise, dainty way that large animals sometimes eat small things, and then he put his chin on the edge of my table. His chin weighed considerably more than the table was designed to bear. The table bent but held. "Easy," I said again, mostly for the consistency of it. The adults broke signal over the next 9 minutes in a sequence I would later learn corresponds to pack seniority, with the alpha Keth reorienting last. Each of them moved through the hold in the same considered way Orr had, reading the space carefully, threading between the refugee population without contact and settling into positions that formed, by the time Keth finished moving, a loose and specific arrangement around my processing station. The handler teams issued recall signals during this process. I could hear the auditory component of the signals, a precisely modulated tone at a frequency the module described as the primary recall channel. The Skorath received the signals and continued settling. The handlers escalated to secondary signal. The Skorath settled more completely. There is a quality to the patience of a large pack animal that has made a decision. It is not the patience of waiting, but the patience of having arrived somewhere and being prepared to remain there indefinitely, which is a very different thing. Deck 4's 340 people had during this distributed themselves into a dense population at the bunk row walls. The net spatial effect was that I was sitting in an approximately 8-meter clearing that contained me, 8 Skorath, my processing station, 1 malfunctioning document scanner, and 11 intake forms in various stages of completion. Commander Haller was at the edge of the clearing. His expression was the expression of a person whose operational framework has encountered a variable it was not designed to process. "Cadet," he said. "Sir," I said. "What are you doing?" "Processing intake documentation, sir. The scanner is experiencing a calibration issue, and I need to use the hand lens for the biometric fields, which takes. Why are those animals oriented on you?" I considered how to answer this accurately. "I'm not certain, sir. I offered one of the juveniles a piece of a ration bar, which may have been relevant. I'm not sure. Did you make a handler signal?" "No, sir. I don't know any handler signals." I said, "Easy." He was quiet for a moment with a quality I recognized as a person performing rapid internal recalculation. "Recall them," he said to the lead handler, not looking away from me. "I've been trying, Commander," the handler said. The particular quality of her voice, careful, precise, performing steadiness while something else was present underneath it, was a quality I recognized from my own voice in situations where I was doing the same thing. "Try the tertiary protocol." The handler tried the tertiary protocol. The Skorath were unmoved. Keth, Alpha, the largest of the adults, with a ridge of slightly darker scale plating along the spine that distinguished him from the others at distance, had taken a position directly behind my chair. The settling vocalization was continuous, and I could feel it through the chair back, a vibration in the wood and metal that my body registered as resonance and increasingly his presence. He yawned, a slow, deliberate display of an extraordinarily large jaw containing a great many recurved teeth, conducted with the unhurried thoroughness of an animal that is not performing but simply has a large mouth and occasionally needs to use the full range of it, and then put his head down on the deck, plating behind my chair. The sound of his skull meeting the deck was substantial. It was the sound of a decision that has been reached and is now occupying physical space. I completed the form I was on and started the next. Commander Haller spent several minutes at the deck entrance on his communication device. The conversation was low enough that I couldn't distinguish the words from my station, but the cadence was one I know from my own experience of organizational logistics. A person working upward through their command structure. looking for the person who can address a problem that has not previously been encountered and, therefore, has no established protocol. These conversations take longer than anyone wishes they would. The people at the top of the chain need to be told the situation, and the situation needs to be explained. And explaining an unprecedented situation to someone who is receiving the information for the first time takes time that everyone in the situation would prefer to spend resolving it. The lead handler, Handler Resson, I would learn her name later, came to my table during this period. She approached from the east side, at an angle that kept the settled adults in her peripheral sight line, with the careful, measured gait of a person who has spent significant professional time moving through spaces occupied by large predators and has internalized, at a level below conscious decision, the set of physical practices that make those spaces navigable. She crouched beside Orr, was still using my table as a chin rest, and spent time observing him with the focused, impartial attention of a professional assessment. She checked his collar indicator. She ran a small handheld instrument along his neck ridge. She looked at his eyes. Then she stood and looked at me. "How long have you been in this posting?" she asked. 17 days before that. Handler training, wildlife certification, field ecology? No. I did the 2-week border service orientation. Scored in the upper third on wildlife module comprehension. She looked at Orr. She looked at Sull, who had, during Commander Haller's communications period, shifted from a sitting position to something closer to a curl with his tail. A broad, flat appendage of considerable length that I had not seen mentioned in the module, and strongly suspected had been omitted for documentation reasons, wrapped around the base of my chair. She looked at the 4 settled adults, and at Keth behind my chair, and at the arrangement of the whole formation. "Did you make a distress signal of any kind?" she asked. "Anything physiological, elevated stress indicators, flight preparation responses, anything a Skorath's threat assessment systems would read as prey distress?" "No, I was doing paperwork." "Did you make eye contact with any of them?" "Probably when they sat down. I looked at them." "How did you look at them?" I thought about this, because it seemed like the question was precise and deserved a precise answer. The way I look at something I'm trying to understand. Not threatening, not submissive, just trying to work out what was happening. She was quiet long enough that I thought she was done and went back to my form. Then she said, "I've worked Skorath for 11 years. Handler certification from the Compact Wildlife Service, 3 posting cycles on containment operations, 1 on protected habitat assessment. I have never seen a pack defect to a non-hailer civilian. I've seen a pack transfer anchor orientation to a secondary handler when their primary was incapacitated. I've seen juveniles orient on handler-adjacent personnel with prior accumulated exposure. I've never seen spontaneous designation under first contact conditions." She paused. "In under 5 minutes, I'm sorry," I said, meaning that I was sorry it had created difficulties. "Don't apologize," she said. "That's not." She stopped, and in the pause, I had the impression she was deciding what category of things she was dealing with. "I need to file an assessment. Don't go anywhere." I had not been planning to go anywhere. I had 10 forms left. She went to Commander Haller. Their conversation lasted longer than his communication device conversation. I observed it in the background way I observe things when I'm working, registering the cadences and durations without processing the content. And what I registered was a person reporting something unprecedented to a person who does not want it to be unprecedented, followed by a period of resistance, followed by a period of resignation, followed by the kind of quiet that follows acceptance of an unwelcome conclusion. Keth shifted during this conversation and put his jaw on my right shoulder. An adult male Skorath's jaw weighs approximately 18 kilograms. I looked this up later. The skull weighs more. The combined weight required me to adjust my posture to continue writing, a slight lean left to redistribute the load across my core, which I did without thinking about it. The way you adjust to the weight of anything that sits on you while you're trying to work. His breath was warm and regular and smelled like mineral rock and cold air, the clean, sharp smell of something that has come from a place with significant pressure differential. His eyes were closed. The settling vocalization in his chest was at a frequency I felt in my collarbone, steady and low, and I found myself tracking it in the same background way I tracked the hatch sound, not with attention, just with awareness. I completed 2 more forms. The scanner rejected both biometric chips. I noted the rejections, made hand-lens transcriptions of both, and attached the notes. Commander Haller came to the edge of the clearing. His expression had changed. It was no longer the expression of a person whose plan has encountered something it didn't anticipate. It was the expression of a person who has been given a formal explanation of the thing that happened, which is in some ways a more difficult expression because it contains the understanding that the situation is what it is, and the plan is not recoverable. Dela Maris, he said. Sir, Handler Resson has filed an emergency pack defection assessment under Compact Wildlife Management, Protocol 11. He read this from his data pad, which I interpreted as a preference for precision over memory in an unusual situation, which seemed reasonable. Under Protocol 11, a Skorath pack demonstrating spontaneous anchor reorientation toward a non-Handler civilian enters. Provisional status determination. During the determination period, operational deployment of the pack is suspended pending formal assessment review by a qualified wildlife provisions assessor. I see, sir. In the interim, the pack cannot be recalled to Handler control for operational purposes. He paused. The extraction order cannot be executed while the pack is in suspension status. I see, sir. The 11 individuals named in the extraction order will not be transferred today. I see, sir. He looked at Keth on my shoulder. A look that lasted long enough to constitute something more than observation, and then he looked at Sol curled around my chair and at the 4 adults in their settled perimeter positions, and at Orr with his chin on my table. He looked at me. Is there anything you'd like to tell me, he said, about what you did? I said, easy, sir. I gave one of the juveniles a piece of a ration bar. I didn't know what else to do. He held the look for another moment. This has created a significant operational complication, he said. I imagine it has, sir. I'm sorry for the inconvenience. I meant this. He was not a villain in the way that the panel might be expecting me to characterize him. He was a person with a legal order whose execution had become impossible through a sequence of events he had not planned for. That is a difficult position to be in, and the complication was not, as far as I could determine, his fault. It was nobody's fault. The Skorath had made a decision, and decisions of that kind don't have a responsible party. He left. I understand that after leaving Deck 4, he submitted a formal operational delay report and 2 communication requests. One to the Compact Resettlement Authority regarding the status of the extraction order, and one to the Compact Wildlife Provisions Central Office regarding the Protocol 11 assessment timeline. I was told about these later. At the time I was finishing my forms, Assessor Helv Doroth arrived at the 3rd hour. She came through the main hatch with 2 data pads and a case of assessment instruments, and the focused economy of movement of someone who has places to be but understands that this is now one of them. She was older than Haller, shorter than Resson, and she moved through Deck 4 with the specific calibration of a person who has spent decades in enclosed spaces with large animals and has learned to exist in those spaces as something other than a disturbance. The Skorath noted her entry and returned to their settled positions. She reviewed Resson's assessment on her first pad. She took her own readings from the Skorath with the instruments from her case, moving through the pack in a pattern that gave each animal a full individual reading, without disrupting the formation. The Skorath received her approach with calm attention, tracking, registering, classifying her as non-concern, and returned to rest when she moved on. Keth opened his eyes for his reading. His eyes were close from that angle, and very clear, and the amber was a deeper color at the pupil edge than at the rim. A gradient I noted and filed away in the category of things I had been noticing about them without quite meaning to. He closed his eyes again when she moved on. She came to my station last. She looked at me with the evaluating attention she had given the Skorath, which I found I did not object to. Then she looked at each of the animals in turn, Keth behind my shoulder, or at my left. Sol curled around my chair, the 4 adults in formation. You're the cadet, she said. Yes, ma'am. 3rd cycle. Yes, ma'am. No handler credentials of any kind. No, ma'am. I scored in the upper 3rd on the wildlife orientation module. She didn't react to this. Did you use any Skorath-specific vocalization or behavioral signal? No, ma'am. I said easy. I gave one of the juveniles a piece of a ration bar. She looked at the ration bar, which was still on my table with its corner missing. She looked at Orr. That one, she said. Yes, ma'am. Mineral dense? I checked the wrapper. Grain and salt, ma'am, she wrote. Skorath have a documented preference for mineral-dense food sources. The salt may have functioned as a positive association stimulus for the initial approach. Or it may have been incidental. The approach may already have been in progress before the food was offered. We can't determine causality from incident observation. A controlled study would be needed. She wrote more. Do you feel comfortable with them present? I considered this honestly. More comfortable than when they arrived, ma'am. Why less comfortable when they arrived? The resonance snarl. The module described it as a compliance mechanism. It registered that way. My body processed it as danger before I'd made any conscious determination. Writing. And now they're settled. The one on my shoulder is heavy, but the vocalization is different. It doesn't register the same way. It's a settling vocalization, she said, without looking up. Used within a pack to communicate acceptance of a position and the pack's intention to hold it. It reads differently to the body because it is different. It's not a threat signal. It's closer to a territorial declaration. She looked up. The fact that you can distinguish between the two frequencies without training is worth noting. I could feel the difference, I said. I wasn't sure what it meant. Most people can feel it, she said. Most people can't engage normally with the settling frequency still present. The threat snarl triggers physiological responses that take time to subside. The fact that you went back to your work while the pack was still consolidating its position around you suggests your stress response recovery rate is unusually fast, or that your baseline physiological stress response is atypically low. She was looking at me with the same impartial, patient assessment she had given the Skorath, or both. I had 11 forms to finish, I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she looked at Keth. Keth is the alpha. For a Skorath alpha to initiate resting contact, physical contact sustained, at a position that places the head below the contact point, within the first 3 hours of a first contact event is not typical behavior. Resting contact at that level of trust expression typically develops over weeks. Sul is in a full curl around the base of your chair. That takes, in standard bonding progression, 4 to 6 weeks of daily contact to establish spontaneously. She paused. What you are describing did not take 4 to 6 weeks. No, ma'am. It took approximately 20 minutes. I'm aware of what it took, she said. I'm trying to establish whether there's a variable we're missing. She looked at her pad. There isn't one. You were in the right place. You were doing the right thing, and you are, apparently, whatever they needed to find. She wrote for a long time. I've been assessing Skorath for 22 years. I've documented 43 anchor designation events. This is the most accelerated initial contact I have on record by a factor of 8. I see, ma'am. I'm going to need to file a formal designation assessment. Given what I'm observing, I think you know what it's going to say. I think I might, ma'am. She filed it at hour 4. The assessment confirmed the pack defection designation under Protocol 11, all 8 Skorath, spontaneous anchor reorientation toward Cadet Dela Maris, border service 3rd cycle, behavioral threshold for provisional designation met and exceeded. It confirmed that the pack's operational status was suspended and would remain so, pending permanent anchor evaluation. It confirmed that the extraction order issued under Commander Haller's operational authority could not be executed by this handler team during the suspension period. The final page noted, in the precise professional language of a document written for a formal record, that the circumstances generating the original deployment. Skorath handler teams in a civilian refugee transit environment for compliance, enforcement purposes, would be reviewed separately by the Wildlife Provisions Oversight Division. I read the assessment later, when Ressin showed me her copy. There is a section in the middle, Section 4, subsection C, that describes what an anchor designation means in behavioral terms, and which I found more useful than anything in the orientation module. It says, in summary, the Skorath do not accept anchor individuals because of credentials, demonstrated capability, or prior exposure. They accept them because of something the assessment calls compatible threat profile architecture, which means, in plain language, that the anchor individual's physiological and behavioral signature reads to the pack as neither prey nor competitor. Not subordinate, not dominant, but present in a way that produces, in the pack's consolidated assessment, the category of entity that the pack can orient to without reclassifying. The module had described the Skorath as apex pack predators who respond to handler signals through conditioning. The assessment's Section 4, subsection C, was describing something different. It was describing recognition. I read that section 3 times. Then I put the pad down and went back to work. Commander Haller left. I understand that his departure from Deck 4 was not what he had planned when he boarded the outer Ven that morning. I understand that his operational delay report was reviewed at the regional command level, and that a formal inquiry into the compliance deployment protocol was opened subsequently. I was not involved in that process and am not in a position to speak to its findings. Resson stayed. She asked, after Dorothy filed her assessment, whether she could remain through the first overnight to observe pack behavior in a settled state. I said the decision wasn't mine and she should ask the duty officer, and the duty officer said yes, with the prompt reasonableness of a person who has spent 4 hours watching 8 large predators arrange themselves calmly around a border trainee with a clipboard, and has concluded that the most functional approach to the situation is to stop interfering with it. She set up an observation position near the meal distribution station and worked through the night. I stayed at my station longer than the rotation schedule required because I was behind on documentation, and also because Sol was still in a full curl that had incorporated the lower legs of my chair into its radius. And I wasn't sure, without any experience to draw on, what the correct approach was to extracting oneself from a sleeping juvenile Skorath's resting position without creating a disturbance. When I eventually stood around the end of the second hour of night cycle, Sol opened his eyes, looked at me, and I said easy and sat back down, and he put his head down again, and I decided the chair could sort itself out in the morning. I slept in the chair. This is not regulation. I have noted it. What I noticed during the night. This is the part of the deposition I am least sure how to describe accurately, so I will simply describe what I observed and let the panel make of it what they will. At some point in the first hour of my sleeping, I was aware, not quite conscious, that the formation around me had shifted, not in a way that woke me or alarmed me, but in the way that a change in ambient sound or temperature registers in sleep as information rather than disturbance. When I opened my eyes briefly, I saw that 2 of the adults had repositioned, closer than their initial settled positions, perhaps 2 meters instead of 4, with their body angles adjusted to face outward from my position rather than neutral. The other 2 adults had maintained their positions but were, as far as I could tell in the dim night cycle lighting, awake, or had moved from my table side to a position between my chair and the nearest row of bunks. Keth remained behind me. Sol remained curled around my chair. I had been in my sleep, positioned at the center of something that was not incidental. I noted this and went back to sleep, because there was nothing else useful to do with the information. Keth slept on the deck behind me. I know this because when I stood in the morning I nearly stepped on him, and because Resson photographed the arrangement. She told me the image was being included as documentation of sustained resting proximity in a first contact context, and that it would be an appendix to the formal assessment. She looked like someone who had not slept, but who had spent the night doing something that mattered. She showed me her overnight notes. There were 14 pages of them. The handwriting was precise even in the sections written at 4 in the morning, which I found both impressive and characteristic of a person who had been doing a job seriously for 11 years. She didn't offer me a copy of the notes. I didn't ask for one, but I read the last entry on the visible page, which said, in the impartial present tense of a field observation, "Formation maintains anchor perimeter integrity throughout night cycle with no handler signal, no anchor interaction, and no observable external stimulus. Pack operating on internal consensus only. Suggest this observation be flagged for extended behavioral study." The outer Venn continued its route. I had 2 more intake cycles to process before Tessic, and I processed them. The Skorath organized themselves around my station, the station with the efficiency of a pack that has established a territory and is prepared to maintain it consistently over time, which is, I gather, exactly what they were doing. They did not disrupt the refugee population. After the first morning, the population stopped pressing against the walls and returned to the ordinary rhythms of people on a long transit, the arguments about bunk, ventilation, the children in the row aisles, the evening meal debates, the card games in the rear section. The change was gradual, and I noted it the way you note gradual changes. Not at the moment of change, but retroactively, when you realize that something you were tracking has shifted without you registering the precise moment of shift. On day 2 of the Skorath's presence, most of the refugees were still navigating the deck with a wide berth around the settlement zone, using the outer row aisles and keeping their children close. By day 4, the adults in the 2 nearest bunk rows had stopped rerouting entirely and were moving through their ordinary paths, which took them within 6 meters of the formation's outer edge. By day 6, one of the Sorinal grandmothers, a woman named Hessa, whose documentation I had processed on day 4, and who had a card game in the rear section, that I understood from context, had been running continuously since the second day of the transit, walked through the formation's outer perimeter to retrieve her grandson's missing boot from under a bunk 3 meters from Orr's position. She did not acknowledge the Skorath. She found the boot. She walked back. Orr watched her through the whole transit and then went back to whatever he had been doing, which was lying with his chin on the floor, producing occasional slow exhalations that communicated, as best I could interpret, a state of meditative contentment. The Vethakari boy, the one from row 3 whose family registration I had processed on day 3, whose name is Orville, and who had, I was given to understand, been fascinated by animals of all kinds since he was old enough to have opinions about things, came every morning to the 4-meter mark from Sol's position and sat down on the deck and studied him with the absolute focused attention that children bring to things they have decided are important. Sol opened one eye, made an assessment, and closed it again. Orville did not move from the 4-meter mark. They appeared, both of them, to find this arrangement acceptable. On the 5th day, Orville was at his 4-meter position when Sol's tail, the broad, flat appendage that I had mentally categorized as the thing the module hadn't covered, made a single lateral sweep along the deck. Not directed, not a signal, just a movement, the way a sleeping dog's leg twitches sometimes in response to something internal. Orville watched this with the expression of a scientist recording a significant event. He did not move closer. He also did not tell his mother, who came looking for him 20 minutes later and found him 6 feet away from a juvenile Skorath, maintaining what I thought admirable stillness for a 6-year-old. His mother's reaction was what I thought it would be, briefly, and then she looked at Sol, and then she looked at me, and I said, "Easy," out of reflex more than intention, and she laughed, a short, sharp laugh of the kind that comes out when you have been frightened and have found that the fright was not warranted, and took her son's hand and went back to the row. Orville came back the next morning. So did his mother at a respectful distance, with her own cup of meal supplement, and an expression of careful neutral observation that I thought was, in its way, exactly the same expression Orville had. On the 3rd day, Heth, the meal distribution supervisor, the person who had run Deck 4's feeding rotation for 11 years, and whose clipboard was more thoroughly annotated than my own, added a line. Item to the evening feeding schedule. She called it Anchor Protocol. It involved a specific quantity of mineral-dense grain supplement, procured through channels I did not inquire about and have chosen to assume were legitimate, distributed from a station adjacent to my processing table at the same hour each evening. The Skorath attended this distribution with the punctual interest of animals who have identified a reliable resource within their established territory. Heth ran it with the same imperturbable efficiency she brought to everything else. She did not ask my opinion about it. When I thanked her, she said that she had been doing deck feeding for 11 years and was not going to have 8 large animals lose condition on her route because nobody had set up a proper protocol, and that if I was going to be responsible for them, I should be at the station at feeding time because they would be, and she handed me a copy of the schedule and returned to her work. I was at the station at feeding time. Orr ate with more enthusiasm than precision. Sol ate with great precision. Keth waited until all 6 adults had been served before he ate, which I noted as significant without knowing exactly why, and Resson, when I mentioned it, said that was an alpha deferral display, a dominance assertion that communicates pack priority order by demonstrating the alpha's willingness to wait, and that the fact that Keth was doing it in the context of a feeding station I was standing at was a further designation indicator. I noted this and did not have a response. By that point, I had stopped trying to respond to each new piece of information about the designation with an appropriate reaction. The information was accumulating faster than I could process it emotionally, so I processed it professionally instead, and moved on to the next form. The permanent anchor evaluation concluded 6 weeks after the Tessic arrival. I completed it on the outer Ven's next circuit, which I was returned to posting for because Assessor Dorath had recommended continuity of environment for the evaluation period. The evaluation itself, I gather, was not complicated. What was complicated was the documentation, which is always what is complicated. There were forms, many forms. They were in the same format as the intake forms I processed every day, with the same field structure and the same biometric confirmation blocks, and I found them familiar in a way that I thought was probably not the intended effect of a wildlife designation assessment, but was, for me, actually reassuring. Forms I know how to do. Forms are legible. A form has fields, and the fields have answers, and when all the fields have answers, The form is complete, and the process moves forward. I process the wildlife designation forms with the same method I used for intake documentation, carefully, completely, and in the order they were presented. Skorath came aboard for the final session. She told me the evaluation had confirmed the designation. She handed me a form to sign, and I signed it. It was, in physical and procedural terms, exactly like signing an intake form. Keth had put his jaw on my shoulder before she finished her opening statement. Sul had found my chair. Orr had taken his position at my left elbow, and Dorothy had broken off the corner of the ration bar I was about to offer him and done it herself, precisely, without comment. As a person who has decided that if a thing is going to happen, it might as well be done correctly. 3 weeks after the Tessic arrival, I was told, by a junior duty officer on the morning shift, who mentioned it in the way that people mention things they assume you already know, that the Deck 4 evening feeding schedule had been entered into the Outer Ven's operational log under the heading Warm Hold Standard. The duty officer said Heth had labeled her own schedule entry Hanker Protocol, and that what anyone else called it was not her concern. The Warm Hold Standard designation had propagated from the operations log to the supply inventory and to the duty officer's nightly summary, which is how informal designations propagate on working ships, not through any central authority, but through the ordinary process of people looking at a thing that is happening consistently and deciding it needs a name so that everyone can talk about it. I was not consulted. I found out because someone assumed I already knew. I want to be clear to the panel about what I think happened on the Outer Ven, because I am aware that there is a version of this incident that makes me sound like something I am not. I am a third-cycle border trainee. I process intake documentation. I did not plan to earn the Skorath's designation. I made at most a sequence of small decisions, each of which was the most immediate useful thing available to me. I kept working because stopping was less useful than continuing. I said easy because it seemed like the right word. I offered a piece of a ration bar because I didn't know what else to do, and it was there. I did not move from my chair because there was no better place to be, and Sul was comfortable, and I saw no reason to disturb something that was comfortable. These are not heroic acts. They are the acts of a person who is not afraid, which is a low threshold, and I mention it without pride, only as a matter of accurate description, because I think the panel deserves an accurate description, even if it is less impressive than the incident report may have implied. I am aware that Commander Haller has submitted a formal challenge to the Protocol 11 suspension determination and to the Wildlife Provisions review findings. I am not in a position to speak to the merits of that challenge and would not attempt to. The 11 individuals named in the extraction order remained aboard the Outer Ven through Tessic arrival and completed their resettlement processing through standard channels. I processed their intake documentation myself over the final 2 days of the transit. They are documented, accounted for, and have been cleared. I include this for the record, not as a claim about the relative legal weight of a resettlement extraction order versus a wildlife protocol designation. That question is for people with more authority than a third-cycle trainee, and I would not know where to begin. What I can tell this panel is what I told Commander Haller before he left Deck 4, which is the truest thing I have to offer, and which I have not revised in the time between the incident and this deposition, because the truest things don't revise well. Revising them makes them accurate and less true if the panel understands the distinction. I was doing paperwork, I said easy. I do not know why they chose me. I know that when Keth first put his jaw on my shoulder, it was heavy and warm, and after a while I stopped noticing the weight because it was simply where he was, and where he was had become part of where I was. And the settling vocalization was a frequency I felt in my collarbone, and eventually stopped hearing as a sound distinct from everything else because it had become part of the sound of the space. I know that when Sul curled around my chair on the first night, I didn't want to disturb him because he was comfortable, and comfort in that hold was not abundant, and I did not want to be the person who interrupted it. I know that on the last night before Tessic, when the hold was at night cycle, and the overhead panels had dimmed, and the row aisles were quiet, and most of 340 people were asleep, Keth moved from his position behind my chair and lay down next to my bunk. I know that I lay there and listened to the settling vocalization in his chest, felt it more accurately as the frequency moved through the bunk frame, for a long time before I slept. I know that at some point in that time, I stopped categorizing the sound as a sound at all, It had become something more like information. Not directed at me specifically, but present in the space, in the way that certain kinds of presence are present, as a fact about what the space is, and what it contains and what it intends. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it. I'm a third cycle boarder trainee with upper third module scores and a hand lens workaround for a scanner calibration problem. I'm not qualified to characterize what a Skorath alpha communicates with a settling vocalization. I'm telling the panel what I experienced. I'll answer questions. I have brought everything that seemed relevant, and a few things that may not be relevant but seemed like the kind of information a thorough record ought to contain. I've also brought the updated intake processing schedule. We worked out a calibration method for the sand scanner using the hand lens and a standard reader spacer cut from a supply crate gasket, and if the requisition for the calibration kit can be processed before the next posting cycle, the workaround becomes unnecessary. But in the interim, it's documented in the appendix and serviceable. The Vethakari identity card formatting issue and the recommended database field order adjustment are on page 4. I think fixing the database default would prevent a significant category of documentation errors on this route going forward, and I've put the technical details in terms I hope the processing office can use. Keth is in the corridor outside this chamber. He has been there since I arrived this morning. The duty officer at the entrance asked me what to do about it, and I said easy, and he sat down. I gather he has been sitting since then. If someone could let him know when we're done, I think he would appreciate the information. Thank you for your time.